It was supposed to be an ordinary morning in a quiet roadside diner, the kind of place where the smell of fresh coffee and bacon fills the air. But for one elderly black veteran, that peaceful moment shattered in an instant when a young man decided his presence wasn't welcome. What began as a cruel, unprovoked act of disrespect quickly turned into something far more shocking, because this veteran wasn't just anyone. And the bully who thought he could humiliate him had no idea whose father he had just touched. What happens next will leave you speechless. But first, please make sure to subscribe the channel and comment below from which city you are watching this video. James Carter was the kind of man who carried quiet dignity wherever he went. At 78, his body moved slower than it once had, but his presence was undeniable. A decorated veteran, he had served his country through storms and battles most people only read about in history books. Now retired, his days were filled with simple routines, morning walks through his neighborhood, evenings spent tending to his garden, and the occasional visit to his favorite diner just outside of town. To most, he was just another elderly man enjoying his twilight years. But to those who knew him, James represented strength, resilience, and sacrifice. He had given his youth to a nation that hadn't always given him the same respect in return. And while he had faced a share of prejudice over the decades, James carried himself with grace, never allowing bitterness to define him. The diner was his quiet sanctuary. The staff knew him by name, often sliding him an extra slice of pie or filling his coffee without being asked. It was one of the few places he could truly relax, where the world felt a little lighter. But on that particular morning, everything changed. A single cruel act, unexpected, unnecessary, and fueled by ignorance, would shatter the calm. The moment seemed small at first, almost like any other rude encounter. Yet beneath it was a deeper wound, one that exposed how fragile dignity can be in a world where prejudice still lingers. And James, sitting in the booth by the window, had no idea that the choice of one young man would soon ignite a chain of events no one could have imagined. The morning rush had just started, and the diner filled with the chatter of locals, the clinking of plates, and the smell of coffee drifting through the air. James sat quietly at his usual booth by the window, his weathered hands resting on the table as he waited for his breakfast. To him, this was routine, almost ritual. To everyone else, it was just another day. But for one young man across the room, James's very presence was a problem. The man was loud, arrogant, and surrounded by a few friends who laughed too easily at his crude jokes. His eyes locked on James, narrowing with a look that carried both disdain and entitlement. To him, James wasn't a respected veteran or even a fellow customer. He was just someone he decided didn't belong. It started with muttered insults under his breath, words meant to sting, but quiet enough to dodge consequence. James ignored them at first, too accustomed to the weight of prejudice to let it ruin his morning. But ignorance rarely stops when it's unchecked. The bully pushed further, raising his voice, making sure others could hear his cruelty. He mocked James's age, his appearance, even the color of his skin. The diner grew uneasy. Some customers shifted in their seats, others glanced away, unwilling to get involved. James kept calm, his back straight, his eyes steady on his coffee cup. Decades of discipline had taught him that silence was often stronger than anger. Then, in an instant, the bully crossed a line. He stood, walked over to James's booth, and with a smirk, delivered a humiliating slap across the veteran's face. Gasps echoed through the diner, the sound of shock slicing through the air. For a moment, time seemed to stop. An elderly man, who had once stood tall in uniform to defend his country, was now reduced to a public target, mocked and assaulted for nothing more than who he was. The diner fell into tense silence. Some patrons fumbled for their phones, others sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The bully laughed, proud of the scene he had created, feeding off the discomfort in the room. James, though shaken, refused to let tears fall. He simply raised his hand to his cheek, his eyes heavy with the pain of being disrespected not just as a man, but as a human being who had given everything to a country that still allowed this. Yet what the bully didn't know was that James's life was bigger than this booth, this diner, or even this morning. Because while the young man saw only an old man to ridicule, James was also a father. And his son wasn't just anyone. He was a man whose role in protecting the nation carried power, influence, and the authority to make people like this bully face real consequences. The diner had no idea that beneath the quiet dignity of the man they had just seen slapped lay a connection that would turn this moment into a storm. And for the bully who thought he had won, his world was about to collapse in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The slap still echoed in the silence of the diner, but what came next would etch itself into every witness's memory. James sat motionless, his cheek stinging, his heart heavy with a familiar ache, the ache of being reduced, once again, to something less than human in the eyes of another. He had faced bullets, explosions, and nights in foreign lands where survival was never guaranteed, yet nothing cut deeper than the humiliation of being disrespected in his own homeland. The bully stood tall, feeding on the quiet fear of the room. He strutted back to his table, laughing with his friends, as if he had just won some kind of twisted victory. The staff hesitated, their hands trembling, unsure if calling for help would escalate the situation. Some customers pulled out their phones to record, but none stepped forward. The cowardice of silence weighed just as heavily as the slap itself. James pressed his hands against the table to steady himself. His body trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of containing his fury. He was a man who had carried a rifle for his country, who had stood on battlefields so others could have the freedom to sit comfortably in a diner. And now, that same country allowed him to be struck down in public while bystanders did nothing. But as the room's tension thickened, a new presence entered. The door swung open, and in walked a tall, commanding man in a dark suit. His eyes scanned the room and froze on his father. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same strength in the jawline, the same quiet dignity in the gaze. This was Marcus Carter, head of Homeland Security, and the man who had just humiliated his father had unknowingly set himself against someone with the power to shake his entire world. The bully had no idea that his smug laughter was about to turn into a nightmare. Because what Marcus saw wasn't just his father being insulted. He saw an attack on every sacrifice, every ounce of dignity, and every principle he had sworn to defend. And in that moment, everything shifted. The diner that had fallen into silence now buzzed with a different kind of tension. Marcus moved quickly to his father's side, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder, his presence radiating both authority and anger. The bully, still smirking, didn't yet understand the gravity of what he had done. But it didn't take long. When Marcus revealed who he was, the room shifted. The bully's laughter died in his throat, his bravado collapsing as the weight of reality crashed down on him. Witnesses who had stayed quiet suddenly found their voices. Phones that had only been recording for shock value now became evidence. The bully's friends slinked back, realizing the joke had ended, and it had ended badly. In that instant, justice began to take form, not through vengeance, but through accountability. The young man who thought he could humiliate a stranger would now face the consequences of his ignorance, not only in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public shame. For James, the pain of that slap would never fully fade. It was not just a physical sting, but a reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice can still be. Yet, in the face of cruelty, his strength shone brighter. And in his son's response, there was proof that the sacrifices of the past had built a future where silence was no longer the only option. This story is more than one man's humiliation and one bully's downfall. It is a mirror held up to society, asking why an elderly veteran, someone who gave everything for his country, was still seen as less than human by some. It's a reminder that racism does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it sits in the booth next to us, waiting for silence to let it thrive. So the question is left for us. When we witness injustice, do we sit quietly and hope it ends, or do we stand, speak, and ensure that dignity is never left undefended?